Hey, welcome to another episode of an ongoing series where we look at the regional differences between two different regions for the same game, and then we showcase all the differences that are in those two different versions. This time around, we're looking at Resident Evil, or if you're from Japan, Biohazard. I think a lot of us already know that Biohazard is the original name in Japan. It's hard to not know that and be a Resident Evil fan.
Resident Evil Biohazard.
But obviously, as a result of that, title screens will look completely different between the two versions, and I guess the question you want to ask yourself is, why did they change it to Resident Evil? Well, as it turns out, it was a copyright issue. Chris Kramer, who worked at Capcom USA at the time, shared publicly that the name Biohazard was already used in a computer DOS game, which would make it impossible to register that name if they were to use it. And so people in Capcom USA held a contest internally to come up with that new name, and that new name ended up being Resident Evil, securing the winning vote amongst the staff. But beyond that, let's talk about all sorts of differences that go far beyond just the title of the game. We got difficulty balancing, we have censorship, we have, for whatever reason, images cut out of the game, as well as music. So first, let's talk about the censorship. Although there's a lot of examples here that I'm going to show you, one of the most glaring ones is very shortly after you start the game. As you see this zombie eating one of the Bravo members, the Japanese version had that member's head roll across the floor. However, in the US version, that little bit is completely cut out. I think it's pretty obvious why they had to make this cut. The less explicit scenes like this one, the more likely you'll be able to pass through the ESRB at the time. But that's not the only aesthetic change, and a lot of aesthetic changes have nothing to do with censorship whatsoever. Like when you're selecting your character for the first time, the Japanese version went through the trouble of writing out hard and easy mode below each character's ID. It's kind of interesting that they took that out. Maybe an argument can be made that they're just different and not inherently easy or harder, but I think a lot of fans will argue that playing as Chris is significantly harder. But the funniest thing of all is that the Japanese version is inherently easier than the international version. This next one is a total mess because the timing gets thrown way off of how much is cut in the US version, but the opening cinematic using live actors has a ton of differences between the US version and the Japanese version. Keep in mind you might have a different version of Resident Evil than the one that was the original first release, and that's what we're looking at today. Everything is in English in both versions, so that means that the Japanese version gets Japanese subtitles. And here's the first big difference. In the Japanese version, they caked a guy in makeup and took the camera really close up to his face to depict a zombie attack. However, in the US version, they went for the trouble of mocking up newspapers, which is a really inventive way of getting around this issue. However, you're going to see that they gave up on that very quickly, as there's a lot of scenes involving Joseph that just got the cut. The first of which being the scene that almost gets shown to the US players, where Joseph is starting to pick up the gun, and then in the Japanese version, you see the hand prop in full view, whereas in the US version, it gets cut early so that the offending part is not shown. Now here's the wildest part. Because there's so much content that gets snipped out of the US version, the two videos completely desync simply on the fact that the Japanese version just has way more content. I recommend you keep your focus on the Japanese side if you've played Resident Evil before and you want to see what's missing here. But I'm letting them both run at the same time just to show you how long it takes for the Japanese side to catch up to the US side. I've gone through the trouble of pausing the US side each time it desyncs, which definitely took a lot of time, but I think the effort was worth it because you get to see a big fat pause sign every single time the Japanese side has to catch up to where the US side is at. Alright, the cast cinematic. First of all, for the US version, they had to place footage that they've already made and placed it on top of Chris Redfield. And for the only reason that I assume is that it's because Chris Redfield smokes over in the Japanese version. Also, if you look at the details in the lower right-hand side, it becomes very obvious that for whatever reason, the US version's footage is a lot more compressed because it's a heck of a lot harder to actually read the details that are supposed to be over there, whereas on the Japanese side, it's pretty clear. Okay, anyways, this is the part of the video where I get to admit to you guys that I laughed out loud when I first heard it. People that played the US version will remember that there's just like this little guitar riff that plays in the background as they're doing the roll call for all the characters. Here, you can give it a listen right now.
Barry Burton. Rebecca Chambers.
You get the gist of it. But now over on the Japanese side, oh my goodness, something's going on here. There's lyrics to the background music and it's all in English too. And it's an absolute mess, man. I'm going to try my best to interpret the lyrics and put it over on the left-hand side here for you, just so I don't have to keep interrupting it.
I got a shotgun.
Chris Redfield. Jill Valentine. Barry Burton. Rebecca Chambers. Albert Wesker. Biohazard.
Easily made covering this episode all worth it. All right, next up, let's just talk about health. In what was probably an effort to dissuade rental game sales, the US version of Resident Evil is a little bit harder. Now, I got a lot of the information I'm using in this video from the cutting room floor, which they will be linked. And of course, a lot of the information you see on the cutting room floor is contributed by other people. In this case, it was theflyingomelet.com, so there will be a link to that as well. But I mentioned this because they mentioned that enemies have more health and deal more damage in the US version. And from my experimentation, I found that they dealt more damage, sure, because your character dies faster, but at least with the pistol and the zombies, I can confirm that it takes the same amount of bullets between both versions. But other things that are confirmed differences are the auto-aiming. There is auto-aiming in the Japanese original version, and in the US original version, they removed that, which, oh, good luck taking out the dogs with that. Also, in such a cruel way, there is 3 ink ribbons for every pickup in the Japanese version to every 2 ink ribbons that are in the US version. And then there's the controls. Now, I don't think this is a difficulty adjustment or anything like that. I think this is just a cultural thing. A lot of US PlayStation players would use X as the button to confirm or collect things. The main button, essentially. But in the original Biohazard, X was used to run, and square was the button that was used to collect things. And if I wasn't clear a second ago, I'm basically saying that those 2 buttons are swapped in the US version. And now here's one of the most bizarre differences. A lot of the documents that you can pick up in Resident Evil 1 simply have nothing going on in the background when you read the document. However, in the Japanese version, there's an image for each of those documents. Here are all the ones that I collected in the amount of time I had to be able to collect footage for this episode. You just saw the botany book, and here's the Keeper's Diary, which seems to have the author's name on the book. And I can see that the last name starts with an S, but I can't quite make out the other letters. You're absolutely welcome to tell me what you think it says in the comment section down below, but the first name is clearly Peter. And then next up is the researcher's will. For the Japanese version, there seems to be 3 pieces of paper making up some documents as well as an envelope. And then here are 6 other unused images that are only used in Biohazard, compliments of the cutting room floor. Again, thank you so much. There's the orders and facts, Plant 42 report, J-Volt report, scrapbook, and security system. But now let's talk about the game's ending. First of all, the ending themes are completely different between the 2 games. The US version has an instrumental track that sounds like this. And then the Japanese version originally had an ending with vocal lyrics. It was sung all in Japanese, and it sounds 90s as hell. So I want to know what these lyrics were. It sounds really campy, and I need to know if the lyrics were campy too. And I'm happy to say that they are. Big thank you to Lazarus_DS over on Twitter, also known as Matthew Alberts, who worked with me to get this whole thing translated. I will have the full song translated over on my Patreon, but here's a couple of snippets that give you an idea of what the lyrics are like. And that's not all for endings. This was really hard to find footage for, but there was this one channel from a Japanese YouTuber. What you've been seeing all the way up to this point is endings that are included in both the US and the Japanese version, but the Japanese version had a very special ending. If you do a New Game Plus and you save both characters in either campaign, whether that be Jill or Chris, you are given an ending that showcases a lot more ouchies, for lack of a better term, that won't get me dinged by YouTube's age restrictions. Here you can see a much more unfortunate fate for certain encounters where the characters came out on top in the original endings. And yes, in case you were wondering, it still uses the theme Yume de Owarasanai. Sadly, no box comparisons this time like past episodes. At this point in time, the show is lacking the funding to be able to do so, so if anyone in the community would love to support so that I can put the funding right back into the show, I'll leave a link to the Patreon in the video description as well as on the screen here. And if you're just interested in watching more content, that definitely helps me out as well. I'll leave a playlist for the other Region Break episodes. They are definitely a worthwhile watch, so I hope you do. Take care, guys.
さよならを越えてまた抱きしめたい